So hi everyone. Okay, what's the time now? It's 12, I guess that's the time we should start now. So yeah, hi everyone, welcome to this second of our second webinar of our education series today. We're going to talk about pH and nutrition. For those who don't know me, my name is Sally Chen, the Education Program Coordinator at PHA Canada, Pulmonary Hypertension Association of Canada. So first, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Sylvia. I think I should stop sharing my screen now so everyone can see her. Okay. So hi, Sylvia. She's a registered dietitian and a clinical researcher from Ontario who was awarded for PHA Canada's PH Family Scholarship in both 2016 and 17 on her study on nutrition status of people with PH. So welcome to joining us today. How's the weather there?
I haven't looked out the window actually all day.
Oh.
So it's 3 o'clock here.
Yeah.
It wasn't too bad. It looked promising this morning. I think we're supposed to have a high of 19. So
oh, that's a
fingers
good
crossed.
Yeah, I heard there was a snow last week, right?
Last Sunday, we got a little bit of snow in London.
Wow. Here it's still very sunny outside. And yeah, but we were raining like for a week. So finally we have some sunlight. Yeah, so for everyone who just come in, we have the Q&A session at the bottom. So feel free to type and write your question and submit at any time. We will answer your question as much as we could at the end of our webinar, the last part. All your question will be, if you choose to be anonymous, you can definitely select it. Your personal information will be protected. And we also have Lo here. Hi, Lo. Helping us. She will be in the background in case for those who come from Quebec or other parts of the country, they speak French. Lo is a native speaker of French. She will help you to translate your question into English and answer it back into French. Yeah.
Bonjour tout le monde. Si vous avez des questions, je suis là pour y répondre. Donc, n'hésitez pas.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Lo. Thank you for helping us. Before I move to our next part agenda, I'd like to invite everyone just to one moment to answer 2 pre-webinar questions. I'm going to start the polling right now, so you will see it on your screen. Please just take, a few minutes, and the first question we are just wondering to know which part are you coming from? And then the second one is about rate your knowledge on pH and nutrition on a scale from 1 to 10. So 1 is like, oh, you think you know nothing about nutrition. And then 10 is like, oh, I'm at expert level of nutrition. So before joining our session. So I'm going to just take 1 minute to let everyone to fill this out. And yeah, don't worry, everything will be submitted anonymously as well. So personal information is protected. And if you have any question, like I mentioned before, about you want to ask Sylvia, we feel free to type and submit your question anytime in the Q&A session. We will answer them in our last part. So let me just finish. Oh, we have 57% of people voted. Okay, let me just maybe wait until we reach 65% or so. Hey. Well, I guess maybe that's good enough for now. Can everyone see the answers? I'm going to share the results. Okay, so majority of them are from Ontario. Thank you for come to this webinar. We are from BC, 24%. Some from Alberta, Newfoundland, welcome. And Quebec, I don't speak French, but bonjour. And okay, and for people who read their knowledge, I can see, okay, quite a few, and nobody declares themselves as expert level, which is well expected. So great. Let me just turn this off. I'm going to share my screen back so everyone can see our next slide's agenda. So here is our agenda today. We're going to first hear from Sylvia about her research from nutritional state on research, nutritional states of a patient with PH. And then our next part will be an interview with me. All the questions are submitted beforehand from our PH community. So thank you so much for those who submitted your questions. We really appreciate that. We will answer your question here at this moment after the presentation. And the last part is our open Q&A. So we will, if we have extra time, we will try our best to answer your questions during this webinar as well. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Sylvia to share her story.
Okay.
There
we go. Give me 1 second to set everything up.
Yep, no worry.
Okay. So, can everyone see my screen here? Oh.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, yes, we can see it.
Okay. Just give me 1 second. Let's see if this. Is the screen still up? Sorry.
No.
It disappeared.
Maybe share it again.
Let's try one more time. There we go.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'll get started. So kind of the aim of this talk was to kind of discuss pulmonary hypertension and kind of the nutrition kind of concerns that go hand in hand with it. So I'll start off by saying, so like Sally mentioned, I've been fortunate to receive some funding from the PHA Canada to support my research, but I don't have any conflict of interest to declare. So as Sally mentioned, so I'm going to be going through and reviewing kind of the various nutrition needs and concerns of those living with PH, and integrated within it, I'm going to share some preliminary results of the research that was funded by the Pulmonary Hypertension Association. And then like Sally said, we'll follow up with some questions and answers, and then an opportunity for some open forum for questions. So to get started, so I'm assuming the vast majority of people on the webinar here are very familiar with pulmonary hypertension, so I won't go over that in detail, but just want to remind you that of the various changes that happen in the body. So for example, vasoconstriction, where there's narrowing of the blood vessels that can happen throughout the body or in the lungs, or resulting blood clots and inflammation associated with pulmonary hypertension. These all go into the mix in affecting a person's nutrition status. Whether it's the fatigue that's associated with some of these changes that make it more difficult to prepare your foods or have that motivation to kind of go grocery shopping or make meals. It all goes hand in hand and kind of puts up some of those barriers that we tend to see with maintaining nutrition status. So knowing these kind of challenges and these changes that happen in the body, what we aim to do, kind of a research team with myself, as well as Dr. Sanjay Mehta in London and Dr. Janet Medill from Brescia University College, which is associated with Western University here. We set out to essentially investigate kind of the nutrition concerns of the individuals living with pulmonary hypertension. So what we did was an observational study. So essentially what this means is that we didn't ask individuals to change their dietary habits or change what they're eating, just to allow us to collect a large amount of information from them, which I'm very thankful for the time that these people took out of their clinic visits and all the extra kind of homework or things that we asked them to fill out afterwards, gave us a really rich database of information. So we recruited 100 people with pulmonary hypertension, and we assessed or collected data over 3 visits to the PH clinic with Dr. Mehta. So this is generally about 4 to 6 months apart between each visit. And again, we collected a variety of information, whether it be through food records, or we had specialized equipment to measure body composition, so things like muscle mass, or we measured or took the information from 6-minute walk test, which is done as part of their usual follow-up, and kind of now have this very large database of research over multiple times. So we're currently in process of analyzing data and preparing these results, but I've tried to integrate some interesting findings from at least that first visitor baseline data that we have from these 100 individuals. So to start, so I'll be going through various nutrition concerns, and kind of how I classify nutrition concerns is kind of 3 main groups. So we have kind of a person's overall nutrition status, but that can also be affected by weight and various nutrients kind of intake in the diet, and they all go hand in hand. So they can all negatively or positively affect each other. And like I said, there are obviously some barriers, especially living with chronic disease, that can be in the way sometimes with maintaining or meeting some of these kind of targets to reach kind of a normal nutrition status. So we'll start off kind of broadly talking about malnutrition or nutrition status in pulmonary hypertension. Unfortunately, it's not been very extensively studied, so we don't really have a lot of statistics to say what prevalence of the population are malnourished or don't have adequate nutrition status, but there's been some small studies done. So for example, when we look at weight, one small study found that kind of the BMI ranged from the normal category up until the overweight category. And then when they assessed nutrition status using something called a patient-generated subjective global assessment, which actually has the patient fill out their own record in their questionnaire, and it rates kind of their nutrition concerns on a scale of 0 to 36. So 0 being no problems and 36 having the worst nutrition-related problems. So they ask questions such as their food intake, weight history, any issues that can affect appetite or intake like nausea or vomiting, even bowel habits, and kind of takes all that and collectively generates a score. So with this small study, again, believe it was only about 22 patients, they found that on average, these patients scored only 2.6 out of that range from 0 to 36. So again, we need more research. So with that in mind, we did analyze or assess for nutrition status in our 100 individuals. So we used a similar technique. So instead of it being patient generated, we performed the assessment ourselves for the subjective global assessment. And myself as a dietitian was the one to complete it. And again, asking for those different things like weight history, food intake, GI issues, etc., to classify individuals on a 3-point scale. So A being well-nourished, a B being moderately malnourished, and C being severely malnourished. So what we found is the majority of patients or participants were well-nourished, so they had a score of A. However, unfortunately, still a relatively large portion, so 40% of those individuals that we recruited were either moderately or severely malnourished. So what this could be a function of is we obviously are noting more malnutrition compared to previous studies that I mentioned just a couple seconds ago, is that maybe there's a disconnect between self kind of perceived nutrition risks versus actual. So we identified more people than that previous study did. That being said, I do think it kind of highlights a big potential for nutrition to affect kind of overall clinical status, whether it be lung function or exercise capacity, or even just quality of life with seeing improvements with making changes to kind of nutrition or diet. So what did we find as well? So going to specific weight and body composition. So we found that the average body mass index was 30, which is just above the overweight category. I'm assuming that this is because we have a very broad range of ages of individuals, and actually us as nutrition professionals, when someone's over 65, we actually recommend that BMI to be a little bit higher. So that higher BMI compared to the previous results from another group probably is more of a function of kind of having a variety of ages and a large portion being over 65. Interestingly though, and what I'm fairly passionate about is the body composition of individuals. So what we found was almost a third of individuals had low muscle mass. So this was regardless of whether they had a high weight or a low weight or whatever category their BMI was, they didn't have enough muscle to meet kind of their recommended needs. So we know this can have lots of implications. In other diseases, it's been well studied that less muscle mass actually means kind of survival time may be less. So again, some potential importance for kind of making sure that you're getting enough protein to meet your needs. That being said, kind of every person is different. So your needs for protein may be different than someone else that you're sitting next to. I'm not necessarily talking about specific recommendations because it's going to vary from person to person. So when we look at weight kind of more broadly, on both ends of the spectrums, there's some concerns, especially related to lung function. So on the side of overweight, or especially when there's unintended weight loss, and especially when it's not just body fat, but also muscle mass. In other diseases, it's been found that low muscle mass or weight loss can be associated with decreased lung function. This can be kind of a result of a multitude of different factors. So it may be, like I mentioned, kind of poor intake of protein to meet your needs, or it can be inactivity that's related to underlying lung disease, pulmonary hypertension, that limits kind of use of your muscles, and that hand in hand with not getting enough protein in your diet can cause some muscle loss. On the other end, overweightness or obesity can also affect kind of lung function and breathing. So having that extra weight on board, especially in the context of not having enough muscle mass to support that weight, can really make breathing more difficult, can make kind of activities in daily life a lot more difficult as well, and can decrease exercise capacity. So this, again, multitude of different factors. So it's sometimes a cycle, right? So having that extra weight on board can limit your exercise capacity, and that in itself is going to cause us to burn less calories, which can cause us to gain some weight. Also, and this is kind of across the board with just general North American diet, we tend to have a lot of kind of energy-rich, nutrient-poor foods in our North American diet. So what I mean by that is kind of those typical high-calorie foods that don't really offer additional nutrients that support our health. And that's not necessarily specific to pH. That's unfortunately kind of our North American diet that tends to be not the most varied or balanced. So this next section, I'm going to be going over specific nutrients that tend to be related or suggested to have a relation to pulmonary hypertension. That being said, like I mentioned with the protein, I'm not necessarily giving specific recommendations or amounts, just because it does vary from person to person. And for some of these too, there are just suggested links. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because you have pulmonary hypertension that you're going to have this concern of inadequate intake or low levels of these nutrients in your diet or in your blood. That being said, not a bad idea to be familiar with these. So if you take kind of a quick glance of your usual intake and realize maybe I'm not getting the most varied intake of certain foods, maybe chat with your doctor, see if there's an opportunity to get maybe some of your blood levels checked, or to talk with a nutrition professional about how to add different foods into your diet to make sure that you're getting a variety of different nutrients. So I'll start off with vitamin D. So this is something that's common again outside of the pulmonary hypertension population. Essentially, the majority of Canadians, especially older adults, tend to be deficient in vitamin D. So this is kind of a result of two main things. One, in Canada, we don't tend to make enough vitamin D from the sun through our skin because we don't have adequate sun exposure. And especially we don't get enough in the summer to be able to last us full through the winter. So sometimes we see that maybe vitamin D levels are normal in the summer where we get more sun exposure. But when we get into the winter, people's levels tend to decrease. That being said, we also want to limit sun exposure for skin cancer risk and skin damage as well. So that limits kind of that possibility of getting extra vitamin D from the sun. And the second point is there's not a lot of variety of foods that have good amounts of vitamin D in it. I'll talk about that in a little bit later. So it is fairly difficult to always meet your needs by diet alone for vitamin D. But how this relates to pulmonary hypertension specifically is that in other lung diseases, it's been better studied. They found that low vitamin D status can actually affect lung function. So there's a lot of research currently, especially with COVID, that are finding a lot of COVID positive patients actually have low vitamin D status. Not sure if that's just a function of overall population tending to be low in vitamin D, or if there is that connection potentially with lung function or lung health with these individuals too. So like I said, it's really only a theory at this point for pulmonary hypertension. So we need more research to actually confirm it in PH because a lot more research has been done, unfortunately, in other diseases, not including PH. So for vitamin D, so our typical kind of high foods of vitamin D, and this is in an extensive list, are things like fatty fishes, things like trout and salmon, sardines, although you want to watch out for the salt content for that especially. But also things like milk in Canada is fortified with vitamin D or fortified milk alternatives. So soy milk, almond milk, if it's fortified, it may have this adequate amount of vitamin D comparable to milk, as well as things like egg yolks actually have some vitamin D in them as well. So what did we find with our research? So of our 100 patients, we only had 81 that had available blood work to review. And very interestingly, we found that it was pretty much split half and half. So 51% had sufficient levels of vitamin D, but 49% had deficient levels of vitamin D. And the interesting point is that even those that were taking a vitamin D supplement, 38 individuals, 28% of those individuals taking a vitamin D supplement were still deficient. So maybe they weren't still getting enough to meet their intake, or maybe that vitamin supplement was just recently started, so we hadn't got that level back up to normal. So hard to say, but still fairly significant results to say it is fairly common to have deficiency of vitamin D in pulmonary hypertension. So that being said, I did mention it is hard to meet vitamin D from diet alone. So I say this with all supplements, that it is important to talk to your doctor before starting a supplement, just to make sure that it is safe given your health status and any potential medication side effects. The next dietary component is antioxidants. So antioxidants are different components in food that actually help prevent or repair damage in our bodies by neutralizing harmful molecules known as free radicals that can kind of wreak havoc in our body and tend to be higher levels, especially with high amounts of inflammation. So these free radicals or these negative compounds can occur naturally in the body. So in some cases, it is a defense mechanism, but it also can come from our environment. So things like smoke and pollutants and certain foods. So things like saturated and trans fats that tend to be more naturally occurring in animal sources or can be actually produced in the process of making processed foods. But there are some things in our diet that we can add to help counteract these kind of more harmful compounds. So when we consider antioxidants, it can be a vitamin, a specific mineral, or something called a phytochemical, which is essentially a component of food. For example, a pigment in food that gives its color is considered a phytochemical and actually can have antioxidant effects. So a good example of that is lycopene, which is actually a red pigment. It gives tomato its red color, and that is an antioxidant. So with sources of antioxidants in our diet, there's lots of different kind of mostly plant-based foods. You can see the long list there of the different specific antioxidants, vitamin C and E, selenium, which is a mineral, different carotenoids, which are those phytochemicals, lots of different variety of antioxidants out there. If you're eating a varied diet, so things like plenty of fruits and veggies, whole grains, nuts and seeds are high in omega-3s, which are an antioxidant. If you're eating a varied diet, you're likely getting some good amounts of antioxidants in your diet to help kind of counteract that inflammation or those free radicals in our kind of bodies. So vitamin C is an interesting one. So like I said, it is an antioxidant, so it does help with inflammation that tends to be associated with things like obesity and inflammation can be common in pulmonary hypertension itself as well. So there is a lot of kind of focus, if you tend to Google kind of vitamins and pulmonary hypertension, on vitamin C. That being said, there's not really a direct link between vitamin C and pH itself, but they have found that in vitamin C deficiency or scurvy, a complication of that tends to be pulmonary hypertension. So we know that direction of relationship. However, it's not really been researched enough to really say that if vitamin D, so for example, or vitamin C, sorry, vitamin C, if we increase it, if it has any effect on pulmonary hypertension. Or if with underlying pulmonary hypertension, low vitamin D status affects it in any specific way. So kind of caution you with vitamin C, there's not really a definitive link between the two, aside from kind of that link between scurvy and pH being a complication. But again, if you're eating a varied diet, you're likely to get sufficient vitamin C from your foods alone. So again, I caution you with this, especially with starting supplements, that especially with antioxidants, which tend to contain a much higher dose than you'd ever get in food alone, that you can have too much of a good thing. So in some cases, especially those high doses in supplement form, there can be interference with your medication. So before you go out and consider starting an antioxidant supplement, you may want to talk to your doctor or your pharmacist to make sure that you're not having any kind of detrimental effects on your medications that you want to be working in full force. So that's especially with the omega-3 supplements or any other antioxidant supplements. So next, this is kind of a recent hot topic, especially in the news and kind of the nutrition world. So talking about gut health or the microbiota. So microbiota essentially is just the collection of different bacteria or microorganisms that live in our gastrointestinal system or our gut. So we do have a large amount of bacteria in our gastrointestinal system. I believe kind of stats that there's more molecules or more bacterial cells in our gut than in our entire body. So they do play a very important role. Ideally, we want the healthy bacteria, though, to be in higher amounts than the harmful bacteria in order for it to help kind of maintain healthy bowel habits. It can help with digestion and breakdown of food. And another big piece, which does go hand in hand, especially with pulmonary hypertension and living with chronic disease, is it helps promote your immune system. So a large portion of your immune system actually lives within your gut. So having a healthy gut microbiota can help increase your overall immunity. So again, kind of a common thread, more research does need to be done to actually confirm the link between kind of certain diseases and kind of gut microbiota. But there's been a lot of suggestions, especially with a variety of different diseases, especially those associated with obesity or inflammation and hypertension itself, that there can be potentially a link between kind of the gut or the variety of gut bacteria and kind of disease. So when we're looking at kind of how to maintain then a healthy gut microbiota, which is beneficial for overall general health, we then tend to talk about things like probiotics and prebiotics. So prebiotics are the food essentially that fuel the probiotics, which are healthy bacteria. So for those, we think of things like probiotic yogurt or other naturally occurring kind of fermented foods, things like kimchi or other kind of pickled or fermented items. The prebiotics tend to be more varied in kind of things like fruits and veggies. If you've heard the term FOS, which is fructooligosaccharides, which is essentially a insoluble fiber that the gut can actually use to fuel these probiotics. So I'll move on to then iron. So iron is important, especially when we're thinking about kind of energy and oxygen transportation in the body. So iron is an important component of hemoglobin, which is a protein in our blood that carries oxygen around our body and gives it to our various tissues and organs. Iron as well is actually an important component or cofactor in a number of different chemical reactions in the body for energy metabolism. So breaking down food to produce energy within our body. So when we're looking at kind of iron status, especially important in those that have limited exercise capacity or difficulty breathing, one study actually found that about 40% of people living with pulmonary hypertension were iron deficient. And they actually found that in that study, those that were iron deficient actually had decreased exercise capacity compared to their counterparts that were had normal iron status. So the theory with this, why this iron deficiency tends to be common, is that it's thought that maybe the inflammation associated with pulmonary hypertension can affect the actual absorption of iron in our gut. Again, that's potentially just a theory, but we do know that it can be fairly common to have low iron status with pH, and a lot of, especially women, sometimes can struggle with maintaining normal iron levels. So when we're looking at iron-rich foods, typical animal sources, things like meats, especially red meats, things like eggs and fish and a variety of different seafood, plant sources. Big ones are things like beans and legumes and lentils, soy products like tofu, nuts and seeds as well have some iron, and our green leafy vegetables also have some iron. Generally, we recommend to have them cooked, so cook spinach, for example, because that cooking process actually releases the iron or has it change into a better component to be able to be absorbed more easily in our gut. That being said, we know that animal sources, we tend to have better absorption of the iron versus plant sources, but there's some nifty kind of dietary strategies that we can do to help increase absorption. So the first is if we add vitamin C along with a plant source of iron, we can actually help increase that absorption capacity of iron in our gut. So something like if you're having a salad, so some lettuce with some beans and legumes and some mandarins or orange slices, get some vitamin D paired or vitamin C paired with your iron-rich foods. The other thing too is actually pairing meat with your plant sources actually helps increase that plant source of iron absorption as well. So a lot of the push towards more plant-based foods, a lot of those kind of meat alternative burgers, not a bad idea, especially if you're trying to cut down on the meat, is that maybe mix your meat with your beans. So make a bean burger that still has some meat in it. So you're getting some iron from that meat, and then you're still getting iron from the beans, and that animal source of iron is actually going to help that absorption of the beans as well. So kind of mixing your sources as well can be a good strategy to make sure that you're getting enough iron. And lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the big one, sodium, which tends to be common more as a strategy to help manage symptoms in pulmonary hypertension like high blood pressure and fluid retention. So with sodium or salt, we need this nutrient in our body because it helps regulate fluid or balance. But as sodium increases in our body, we tend to then hold on to more water and attempt to make that concentration of salt or sodium in our blood the same. That being said, with this increase of extra water being held on by the body, it puts more pressure on the heart then to pump this extra volume around the body. So when we're looking at kind of salt recommendations, generally we need kind of at minimum of around 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day for those normal body functions. This is about only 3/4 of a teaspoon of table salt. It can be fairly hard to meet these recommendations. Mostly it's those that are eating kind of fresh home cooked meals. You can meet that 1,500 milligrams. Generally, kind of the upper limit that we say is around 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day, and that's about 1¼ teaspoons of salt. However, we know, again, with our North American diet, we do tend to eat excess amounts of sodium, and across Canada, the average intake is about 2,800 milligrams of salt. So what we know is that kind of the big culprits of salt in our diet or sodium is those processed foods. So there is a component that comes from salt being added at the table, and that's naturally occurring in some food, but really the big portion, sometimes about 80% of our diet or dietary sources of sodium is from processed or prepackaged foods. So the kind of suggestion I give is really being an expert at label reading. So if you do have a food item that has a nutrition label, switch over to the nutrition facts table and look at that percent DV or daily value column. So we ideally want to aim for less than 15% of that number. So that says that that portion of food based off the serving size will give us 15% of the salt that's recommended to be eating in a day. So ideally less than 15%. I like to tell people, so if we're looking at 5%, that's considered a little, 15% is considered a lot, so we want less than 15%. Not always easy to find a product across the board that has less than 15%, especially things like soups. A lot of hard cheeses tend to be high in salt. So when it's not possible, you really want to compare products or even different versions within the same brand, and at least choose the one that's lowest in sodium. And obviously be careful about how much you're having of that in the day. So if you are going to have a higher salt item, make sure that you're just being more cautious, and all the other foods that you have in the day are those lower items. So you're not adding up to those high amounts of sodium in a day. Other strategies, as much as really you can cook from scratch, you can have as much control over the salt as possible. So cooking things like soups or sauces from scratch and limiting the amount of salt that you're adding in, or it's maximizing things like herbs and spices, so you don't need to use salt, can be a good kind of way to pull out some of that extra salt from our diet. Also things like canned foods, although they're nice and convenient and nutritious, they do tend to be packaged with a lot of salt because it is a preservative. So things like canned vegetables or beans, thoroughly rinsing them can at least pull off some of that extra salt that's on the outside. Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily pull out some of the salt that may be in that food. So again, read those food labels and try to aim for a low salt canned item. So I could probably talk for multiple hours about kind of sodium and all these other things, but I'll kind of end with kind of a takeaway message that there is kind of promising potential that nutrition can have a good effect in kind of the lives of people with pulmonary hypertension, whether it's related to disease severity or lengthening prognosis or affecting quality of life. A lot of the research that is out there, although limited, is very promising. But generally, kind of, this is obviously not talking about kind of, we know that there are barriers sometimes to meeting nutrition needs, but generally a balanced diet that's rich in things like fruits and vegetables, lean meats, whole grains, low-fat dairy, beans and legumes can help ensure that you're meeting your nutrient needs for all of these components that we talked about. So, like I said, I know that living with a rare chronic disease, there's lots of barriers that sometimes are in the way with achieving these needs. So if you have access to a nutrition professional, whether it's through your family doctor, or if you're at a family health team or a community health center, or reach out to one that's kind of in private practice to help work with you one-on-one, that can be potentially very beneficial with kind of improving your nutrition and meeting kind of your own individualized personal needs. So yeah, of course, kind of be aware of these concerns. If you do have concerns, talk to your doctor about where you can get access, or talk to your doctor about checking maybe some of your levels of things like vitamin D to assess kind of need for dietary changes or potential supplementation for some of these. So that reaches me to the end. I listed my references because that's what we do in academia.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. That's really a very good presentation. It's quite of shocking that you said the average Canadian sodium intake is up to 2,800 milligrams. That's really a lot. Yeah. So we actually have one people asking about sodium. This he is wondering, do people who are healthy need to restrict the salt intake to less than 2,300 milligrams sodium?
So ideally, everyone really should be on a low sodium diet, which is the recommendations between that 1,500. So that 1,500 is really kind of the minimum needs. So between 1,500 to 2,000 or 2,500 sometimes. It's kind of a broad range. Generally, so there's lots of research out there that has kind of looked at how salt intake can affect things like blood pressure. What I tend to like to say is that really, if we're having a high intake of salt in our diet, it's probably because the quality of our diet is probably not the greatest. So if you're eating kind of a healthy, balanced, varied diet, low in processed foods, you probably don't need to worry about kind of tracking your salt intake because it's probably within those kind of target levels.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you also mentioned that you are still collecting all the data and so I'm just wondering to know, what do you expect to find, and if you have a chance to look everything over once you finish, collecting all the data, your hypothesis, something around that?
So my kind of hypothesis is what I'm kind of expecting to find is, because we're tracking things over time, we're hoping to kind of assess kind of how nutrition and disease severity or breathing function kind of relates to each other. And my thoughts are that likely in those individuals that maybe worsen in some of those visits, that their nutrition status is probably going to go down with it. However, kind of knowing that there are these barriers to kind of maintaining nutrition and that kind of seeing meaningful changes with nutrition sometimes takes time, I'm assuming that maybe that as their disease function or disease severity improves, that there may be a little bit of a lag to their nutrition status improving as well. So to me, that means that having kind of nutrition support or nutrition professionals kind of in that circle of care kind of really help those individuals that kind of struggle with kind of their disease, whether it worsens or not, can have some potential positive benefits.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen back. So if you don't mind, yeah. 1 second. It seems I'm not sure why I couldn't share out the screen now. Oh, that's a little bit interesting. I don't know why I suddenly couldn't share out the screen. Well, I get it. Okay, so let's move to our second part. But before we move to there, I'm going to just bring up, take the chance to bring up a related video, also presented by you, Sylvia, about nutrition and people who have interstitial lung disease. As we know, PH could be a very common complication of it. So can you just tell us briefly about this video?
Yeah. So this video is actually the public lecture from my PhD that I defended in the summer. And like Sally said, it's with a group of patients with interstitial lung disease. And what we found is that we looked at body composition and we looked at survival time, and that we found that those individuals that had those low levels of muscle mass actually lived shorter than those that have adequate muscle mass. And a lot of the research in interstitial lung disease has actually suggested that having a higher BMI is actually protective, which we always kind of wondered, is it the weight in general, or is it maybe the body composition that makes a difference? So what we found is that muscle, independent of BMI, was significant, which means that it really is that muscle component of the BMI that offers those protective effects when it comes to survival. And we also found that nutrition status as well was associated with those that had lower nutrition status, had poorer survival.
For those who are interested to know more, this video is on YouTube. I will send a link in a follow-up email, so feel free to watch it at your own time because we don't really have too much time here. So yeah, let's move to the second part. What should people living with PH know about nutrition? So thank you everyone who submitted your question in advance to us. All the questions in part 2 are submitted either by email or written on Facebook. So let's hear from Sylvia. The first question is about ketogenic diet. It's really a hot topic this day. So actually one of our knowledge philanthropists, John Pendy, he also wrote a blog about ketogenic ketogenic diet could be very beneficial for people living with PH. So we are just wondering to know, is this ketogenic diet really good for people living with PH? And would the ketogenic diet increase the risk of getting ketosis? I guess we first need to know what is ketosis as well.
So ketosis is kind of a state that the body kind of becomes or turns into when there's not enough carbohydrates or sugar for the body to use as fuel. So when someone's in ketosis, it means that the body is producing something called ketones that are a byproduct of fat metabolism, and they use that as the main source of energy. In some diseases, so especially diabetes, we tend to want to avoid ketosis. There's something called diabetes ketoacidosis, because with the increased ketones, it tends to change kind of the pH or the kind of acid level in our body. So it can be harmful for those individuals, but kind of ketosis on its own has been kind of a hot topic when looking at the ketogenic diet. So essentially the ketogenic diet is a very, very low carbohydrate diet, high in fat, to switch the body into fat metabolism or fat sources as energy. That being said, there's a lot of research that's being done. It is a fairly new diet, so there's really not any definitive results yet. It has been shown kind of anecdotally and in some research that it does help with weight loss, which in the context of pH may be beneficial for some weight loss. However, it's not been studied against other diets. So there's no research showing that it's more effective than any other diet. But that being said, everyone has different strategies and finds success in different ways. So it can help some individuals with losing weight that didn't have success in other methods. But kind of the takeaway I'd say for that is just being cautious that there's not a lot of long-term research studied with this. And it can be high in kind of high salt foods and high unhealthy fats as well. So it has to be really well planned to be healthy. And when we're looking at kind of the diet in general, because it changes your body chemistry, you actually kind of have a little bit more difficult with gaining muscle, which, like I've kind of talked about a lot, is that muscle is very important too. So it is hard to build muscle when you're in ketosis. So kind of take those all into account when you're maybe considering it.
Yeah, exactly. Like you mentioned in the research presentation, 30% of people actually have some low muscle mass, right? And that's the things if that could happen if they have increased risk of this ketosis. So, oh, by the way, for those who want to know more about John's blog, you can definitely visit our PHA website. It's under news and media website session. There's a list of blogs and you can take your time to read all of them. So the second question is also about protein. As we know, the normal recommended protein intake is 0.8 gram per kilogram of body weight, but the recommended protein intake for people living with chronic lung disease is in between 1.2 and 1.7 gram per kilogram. Why do we need this much? This is almost like double.
So this is a very good question. So very knowledgeable individual that had this question. So right on target with those recommendations. So general recommendations are that 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, but especially with chronic disease and especially in older adults. So as we get older, we tend to lose more muscle mass, just as a function of aging. So we do actually need more protein in our diet as we age to help counteract that muscle loss. With the chronic disease as well, because there's changes in kind of the body, potentially more stress or inflammation that can increase our needs for whether it be calories or protein, especially because we may see some protein breakdown or extra stress in the body that kind of increases those needs to kind of maintain normal levels. That range, the 1.2 to 1.7 is a fairly large range, and up to the 1.7 can be very high. So it is kind of difficult to say across the board how much someone needs, because again, it varies on weight. So if you have access or have a nutrition professional that you can meet with to help kind of assess and kind of determine how much you need, that would be beneficial to kind of make sure that you're getting kind of exactly how much you need given your situation. Your activity level plays into that as well. Lots of different factors, but kind of right on target. Those are the general recommendations. Kind kind of
Yeah,
higher than usual.
we actually have one person asking a related question about this. So in order to increase our protein level, she is wondering, would you recommend protein shakes for PHers?
So I tend to kind of favor more food over supplements or kind of nutrition drinks as well, especially in those individuals that are having a hard time eating enough. So if they're getting full early, protein drinks not a bad idea. Sometimes it's easier to drink our calories and drink our protein than having to sit down and eat a full meal.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't want it to displace kind of whole foods, because you are going to get other things like those phytochemicals or their antioxidants in whole foods. With protein supplements, you just want to be a little bit careful. Some of them can be high in sugar just for this flavor. And really a lot of them can be very, very, very high in protein. Generally what we say is that really the kind of maximum absorption or the most efficient absorption of protein is 30 grams at a time. So I wouldn't necessarily exceed a protein or get a protein drink that's more than 30 grams, because your body's probably not going to use it all efficiently.
Oh, that's interesting to know. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So this is also a question from PH community. A member said, for someone with PH, low blood sugar, and lots of food allergy, is half protein a good way to increase this level of high intake?
So I can't necessarily kind of comment on the low blood sugar or the allergies, but I'm assuming kind of the allergies are limiting some of the protein, typical high protein foods. Hemp protein is actually a really good kind of biological level, kind of good quality protein that's a plant source. So if the hemp is working for this person, I would say continue with it for sure.
Okay, thank you for the advice. So, this question is a little bit challenging as it's somehow clinical. We have one person specifically wondering, as you also mentioned about antioxidants in your presentation, are NRF1 and NRF2 supplements recommended to PH patients for concerns like oxidative stress? I guess we still need to know what is NRF1 and NRF2 first.
So this question's testing my genetics knowledge. So my understanding is that these are actual specific genes in the body or related to specific genes that can actually kind of affect kind of the oxidative stress and antioxidant needs. And there are some supplements that contain these. I think there is a medication, resveratrol, I believe that's one of these. Again, I would caution you with kind of the supplement form of antioxidants, just because they're very high doses, and depending on what medications you're on, it can have interference with those medication kind of effectiveness. So this is probably a good question to talk to your doctor about or your pharmacist to make sure.
Okay, thank you. Our next question about nitrate. Is it okay to eat foods with nitrate even if one has been told to avoid nitrate medication by doctor?
So this is similar to kind of the antioxidant kind of information.
Yeah.
So nitrates in foods, depending on the food source, will have higher amounts than others. So nitrates are sometimes naturally occurring in food. So fruits and vegetables have nitrates, but because they're naturally occurring, they're not as high levels. That being said, nitrates are used for things like cured meats or smoked meats as a preservative, so they can be in higher amounts. So generally we want to limit those just for general health, and especially if you're needing to avoid kind of nitrate medications. I would have that chat with your doctor too to see if there is any concerns from kind of those food sources having any kind of interactions or effects kind of on your body. That being said, though, those high nitrate items, those cured or smoked meats, we generally want to limit anyway, because they're not the most kind of heart healthy, with kind of the unhealthy saturated fats that tend to be associated with them. So from a general recommendation, you'd want to limit those extra kind of additives or nitrate additives that are added to different kind of cured meat products.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is a little bit more specific. So by knowing someone who drinks 2 cups of coffee every day and have been having digestive problem on and off for at least 4 months, what food would you recommend for her immune system? Would it be possible that she maybe have, become sensitive to the milk or lactose, coffee, this kind of thing?
Yeah, so this one's a hard one because I don't necessarily have the full kind of picture of the situation. So I can't necessarily talk about the milk sensitivity because there can be a slew of other reasons as well. But talking about the immune system, so especially going back to the slides about the gut microbiota or gut health, so things like probiotics, things like probiotic yogurts can help kind of increase those healthy gut bacteria. And that can have a direct link to kind of increasing immune system or immune function as well.
In relate to the gut health, you just mentioned in the presentation, she also have a follow-up question. She mentioned she had bad reflux this day, and then she talked to her pH specialist and changed the timing of her medication, but she's still having bowel issue. And then would you have like any recommendation on how to improve this situation?
So kind of the same recommendation is for kind of constipation versus diarrhea. So soluble fiber, so there's two different types of fiber, soluble and insoluble. The soluble absorbs water in our gut. So you want to make sure you're drinking enough fluid for that soluble fiber to absorb. And that essentially makes our stool more gel-like or more soft. So in diarrhea, it makes the kind of liquid stools a little bit more firm or gel-like. And with constipation, it takes those hard stools and it makes it more gel-like. So it kind of pulls it into kind of the normal. So I'm not sure with the digestive issues on which side. I'm assuming maybe the diarrhea, if there's potentially a milk sensitivity, but things like the kind of flesh of fruits and veggies, things like applesauce, oats and beans or barley are high kind of soluble fiber items. In those individuals that are having really severe diarrhea, sometimes we want them to pull back on some of that insoluble fiber. So that's like the skin and the seeds of fruits and vegetables, or kind of whole seeds or whole nuts, because that type of fiber tends to push things a little bit faster through our GI system. And when we already have that diarrhea that's moving fast, we may want to limit that and make sure we're getting enough soluble to kind of gel like the bowel movements.
Yeah, so like you said, the medication, somehow the side effect could cause a diarrhea, and then that can impact the function or the level of the nutrients, how it can be absorbed in our body, right? Okay, let's move to the next one. We have one more question I didn't put in. Oh, it is here. I just received this morning from a newly diagnosed patient. So he's wondering, regard to the sodium we mentioned, we have such high sodium amount that we have to cut it down. Would you have any suggestion on low sodium meal, and overall, like any tips for how to receive that?
Yeah, so like I said, as much as kind of cooking from scratch, you can control kind of the salt. I know on the PH website, there's lots of different recipes and kind of resources too, which are great. But really kind of reading the labels, especially if you're doing prepackaged meals or frozen meals, really like looking at that nutrition facts table, and something like an item on its own, for sure less than that 15%. And I believe that's usually about, for looking at a meal on its own, you may have a higher amount than that 15 because that's encompassing a whole meal rather than one item. So generally for those frozen meals, we want to aim for at least less than 400 milligrams when we're looking at the actual amount rather than the percentage.
Okay. And his next question is about the grapefruit and citric fruit. So can you explain more about grapefruit and the dangers they pose? Is this for all citrus fruit that they are, kind of dangerous? Is it combined with medication?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm assuming it's medication related. Again, more of a pharmacy question, but with the grapefruits is that there's a certain component that affects actually a part of our liver that metabolizes or kind of activates medication. So it can make medications more effective, which is not always a good thing, or it can make it less effective in some cases. So it's the grapefruit specifically, not across the board for all citrus fruits. So things like lemons or limes or oranges won't have that same effect. It's specifically grapefruits. And I've recently learned too that actually pomegranates, so more pomegranate juice, so the pom juice in concentrated effects sometimes can have, or concentrated amounts can have those effects, whereas kind of little individual pomegranate seeds shouldn't have that same issue. So it's mostly just the grapefruits, not all citrus fruits.
Okay. Let's move to our third part. I see we do have some questions, but we're a little bit running out of time, but we will try our best to answer, most of the questions. So a person is wondering, can we eat licorice and ginger, like if they have PH?
So the licorice, I think, especially pure like black licorice, it can have effects with our heart. So I'd caution that individual with that, and maybe talk to their doctor and their pharmacist. And the ginger, it shouldn't be necessarily an issue if you're having it in food source, adding it to recipes or making ginger tea. It shouldn't. I'm not familiar, at least, with it having any detrimental or negative effect with pH or kind of health or medications.
And how about alcohol? If patients have a pH, can they still allow to have some alcohol? Like, do you have any perspective you would share on that?
That is a good question. I don't 100% know. But I know general recommendations is moderation for anyone living with pH or not. But I don't sure.
Maybe
so I'm going to have to say I don't know.
Consult with a specialist, I guess. It's will be more useful. Okay, so thank you everyone who participated in today's webinar. But before we leave, I do have a after webinar poll. I would like everyone to take one moment to answer. So I'm going to just share my screen as well and launch the poll. Please just take 1 or 2 minutes well, it won't take 1 or 2 minutes to finish it. If you could, we will really appreciate. It's just to test how do you think your nutrition knowledge is this improved after attending this webinar or not? And we really appreciate that. Thank you for those who is entering. Oh, we have 77% voted this time, which is good. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the result. Oh, it seems like we do have a little bit improved, which is good. Some people think they're at the expert level of knowledge now, which is excellent. So yeah, again, thank you for participating our webinar today. And as I said, the video we just posted before about the ILD will be available on YouTube. So the follow-up email will have the link of it. So feel free to watch it at your own time. And thank you again for joining us and taking your time out of your busy schedule. And for those who participate as well, hope you have a wonderful day and wonderful evening as well. Yeah. So
thanks everyone.
Yeah, see you next time. Bye.